Good morning, guys. Welcome to another day. Today's Friday, the end of the week. I hope you're looking forward to the weekend. Looking forward to sleeping in a little bit myself. All right, today, the first thing we're going to talk about, just an interesting note, we're going to talk about the Civil War and photography. I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the lessons, but one thing about the Civil War and photography, before the Civil War, there weren't a lot of photographs of war. And so the American Civil War was really the first conflict that was so well documented by the photography. And like 20 years before the Civil War, photography had pretty much become commonplace, but it was not something that you would have a lot of extra photographs of. It was expensive, it was cumbersome, and you would want to be very careful with any photographs that you took. So photographs, you might have a picture of your family taken, but then that would be something that would be kept in a house. It wouldn't be something that you would do out on the battlefield. With the Civil War, you had more photographers popping up. People were buying the equipment and developing this hobby. And Mathew Brady is probably the most famous Civil War photographer. A lot of the photographs that we see weren't necessarily taken by him, but they're attributed to him because he would hire crews of photographers to go out to the battlefields and take photographs. Some of the significant impact of Civil War and photography is that soldiers were now able to take pictures of their loved ones with them to the battlefield. Photography was cheap enough that they could have a picture of their wife or their girlfriend or their mom or their brother or something with them on their person when they go into battle. And that was something we hadn't had before. Soldiers, the dead, after a war, of course you've got a battlefield that's in ruins, you've got broken equipment, cannons and guns and dead bodies, and this is something that in the past wars might have a battlefield taken a picture of after the fact, and you don't necessarily have the soldiers there, and maybe it's been cleaned up a bit and some flowers are growing over it. But in this case, you would have photographers right there during the battle, and you could have photographs while the smoke is still lingering in the air. Now, it was not so quick that if you took a picture and somebody was moving, they would end up like a ghostly blur. So the photographers were really careful not to take a picture when there was too much action, but if there was just some smoke moving around, then that would be all right. It gave the impact to the people that would see those photographs later to let them know what war was actually like. And that's something that's so important to understand, because as we move further and further into peaceful times, the people that are not involved in the war don't see that direct impact of the war, and the only way that that gets conveyed to them is through images and writing. And images can be some of the most impactful ways of spreading that message. We've got the people in the North that were not on the battlefield, they were not having soldiers march through their town. They would not have been so aware of what was going on the battlefield except by looking at photographs in the Harper's Weekly. Let's see what else. Yep. So right before the Civil War, you ended up with new, cheaper ways of mass-producing photographs that hadn't been around before. The photographer would take a cumbersome wagon load of chemicals and equipment out to the army camp or out to the battlefield, and it wasn't like they just bring their camera with them and they're snapping pictures. They have to take a whole wagon load, and each time they wanted to take a picture, they have to mix the chemicals, they have to prepare a photographic plate, and be like a plate like this, right? So, and they're going to treat it with chemicals so that it's sensitive to the light. They expose it to the light, and then they have to later go back and treat it expose that image to a piece of paper so you actually have a photograph and not just a big piece of glass. Now, one of the ways that was a new method that just came about during that time is albumin paper. Albumin is the egg white. So I'm getting ready to make my breakfast here, so let's take a look at this. So if we look at, this is the egg white. Egg white is something that's going to be poured into a bowl or a vat. They'd have whole groups of women. Oops, got the yolk in there. They have groups of women breaking open dozens and dozens and dozens of eggs, and then with that egg white, they would whip it up into a mixture that they would then coat on a piece of paper. So to coat it on a piece of paper, basically you're going to have this whipped up egg white mixture, and then you lay down a piece of paper over the top of it and let that egg white soak in a little bit. And that would be something that would be really sensitive when you exposed it to the light that you were trying to develop an image on. So that was interesting development of Civil War photography. Okay, so as far as our lesson for the day, getting down to the lesson, we are looking at the end of the Civil War. We are not going to go into a lot more of the details of the Civil War. I really wish we could. There are a lot more events of the Civil War, a lot more technology, art, music, culture, things like that that I wish we had time for, but I want to move on to Reconstruction. So next week we're going to go into Reconstruction, which is the aftermath of the Civil War, which brings us back to some of the details of what got us into the Civil War, and then some of the failed solutions that came out of the Civil War. But for now, go back through the slideshow. I will post a review sheet sometime over the weekend so that you guys have an idea of the most critical facts that I want you to know for the Civil War for any assessment we have coming up. But these are the summary of what we've gone over for the Civil War. And if you look at the slideshow, it's the very last slide. It sums it all up right there, then with hyperlinks to take you into the specific slides that have those details. Number one was Fort Sumter. Remember, that was where the first shots of the war happened. That's where the Confederacy got confidence because they were able to take a stronghold of the Union, but it was also the impetus that gave the Union the call to action. All right, and we need to gather some troops to defend this Union. Number two is the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision really brought out the fact that citizenship is limited by race, and that was something that that abolitionists would be motivated for changing. And Dred Scott decision also really brought to light the idea that compromise on slavery was not going to work. We had been trying compromise for 10 years, and 10 years had ended up with us on the verge of civil war. This is not going to be our solution. The election of 1860. 1860 was clearly that the election of Abraham Lincoln meant to the South that their needs were not going to be met. You have somebody who's clearly opposed to slavery in the White House, and if that's the case, then they don't feel that their needs, which at that time their number one need was making sure that they had slaves so that they could continue their cotton production. So if their needs are not going to be met, then they're going to leave. And also, on the other hand, for the abolitionists, for Abraham Lincoln being elected, that meant that there was hope that we might eventually get rid of slavery. North and South differences. Make sure you know the differences between the North and the South, the ones that matter, the ones that lead us into Civil War. The North was industrial. North had a greater population. It had a lot more transportation and railroads and free citizens. The South was agriculture, cotton-based, and slave-dependent. That was really where we end up with our Civil War. Confederate strategies. They wanted to defend, they wanted to outlast, and they wanted to bring in foreign influence to help support them and recognize them as an independent country. The Union strategies. They wanted to keep their border states, those states that still had slaves, but they were still part of the Union. They wanted to keep those as a buffer zone. They wanted the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to make sure that they could cut off the access to trade and transportation for the Confederate armies. And then the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a wartime strategy to free the slaves in those rebel states, and it gave slaves hope to escape and gave moral reasoning for the people that are still part of the Union that this is a noble cause. This is a cause to preserve the United States of America, and we need to do this because this is our greater goal. It's not just defeating an army of people that disagree with us. It's about keeping the United States together. And then finally, the last major deal was Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg. It was the last Confederate effort into the North, and then the Gettysburg Address was the big picture idea. And again, bringing back to the moral argument that it is the right thing to do to make sure that our country continues. Oh, actually, I mixed that up with the Emancipation Proclamation. But Emancipation Proclamation brought in the moral reasoning that slavery is wrong and we should continue to fight against it. And the Gettysburg Address was the big picture idea that we are not fighting just against a battle of people that disagree with us, but we are fighting a battle to preserve the Union. All right, that's the end of the Civil War. Next week will be Reconstruction. Those of you who are logging into Google Classroom and Schoology, keep doing that. Some of you are not turning in some of those assignments, so I'll need to be contacting you to find out what the problem is. The two big assignments that I do need you to turn in are the Fort Sumter questions and the Civil War geography assignment. So, hope you guys are doing well, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.